So this is the Daf Yomi for Shabbos, and we're going to start on the bottom of Chaf Beis and Lav Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. Amar Rav Hakro Masnisa Masailehu Rabbi Yochanan. Brisa that supports the position of Rabbi Yochanan, who says Isho Mishum Chitzav. He says the fire, you're liable for the fire that spreads on account of your arrows. What's the verse? Verse says Kiseitze Eish. It says in the pasuk when fire goes out, which means Seitze Me'atzma. This implies if it goes out on its own. And Rashi says you can't say that the verse is talking about when he himself lights the stack of his friend, but rather means it goes out from his own. He lights the fire in his own stack, and then from there it goes and lights his friends. And nevertheless, it's called in the pasuk Yishalem Hamavir Es Habeira. The one who lit the fire has to pay. He's called the Mavir, as though he lit it himself. So we see from here that the fire is liable because it's chitza, because it's his arrows. And indeed, Masnisa, we have a brisa that supports this concept also. The Tanya that the brisa says, Pascha Kosov, on the top of Chav Gimel Amid Aleph, Pascha Kosov Benitzke Memono. The Torah starts by talking about the damages of his own money, because it says Kiseitze Eish, which implies on his own. Besim Benitzke Gufo, and it concludes with the fact that he is the one who did the damage, because it says Hamavir. To tell us that he's responsible for the fire because it's his arrows. So now Gemara says, Amarava, Kashule, Abaye had a difficulty. According to the one who says that the fire is liable because it's his arrows, then if that's the case, Tamam Ba'esh, the Pater Achmana, if we know that when it comes to fire, if it goes to a utensil that was covered at the time, we know that a person is exempt. But how can we have such a situation where?
Shmuel,
yes,
I had a call from Mindy.
Yes.
So where are you now? Where are you now?
We're on 23a. Chaf Gimel Amid Aleph, 23a, second line.
Okay.
So we know. Okay, so we know that Taman de Ba'esh, we know that when it comes to fire, it's going to be exempt. So where can we say that a person, what's the circumstance in which we could say that a person will be exempt for his fire? Meaning to say, it's clear from the Mishnah on Dav Samach Aleph that according to the Chachamim, if a person lights the Gadish, he lights the stacks of his friend, and there are utensils hidden, he's going to be exempt for the damage done to those hidden utensils. But this law only works if we can say that he's responsible because of his mamono, because of his money, because then we're going to exempt him for the utensils that were hidden, because he didn't know where they were, and he was an onus. It was unknowable. But according to the one who says it's because it's his arrows, well, when you say it's his arrows, you're in effect saying that he's a person who's doing the damage, because a person is liable even if he was an anus. As we said earlier in the Gemara, that a person is adam mu'ad l'olam. We said this back on Daf Gimel. So if that's the case, if you're saying like Rabbi Yochanan that Isha Mishum Chitzav, then why are we saying that he's exempt for the utensils that are hidden? That was a question that Abaye asked. And so says Abaye, we're 4 lines from the top on Chav Gimel and Aleph. Nichale, I'll tell you how you could be exempt if it is hidden. Kigon, even though we say Isha Mishum Chitzav, Kigon Shenafot Leiko Oso Chatzer. So we have to talk about a situation where a person lit the fire in his courtyard, and then after he lit, at the time that he lit the fire, there was a fence in his courtyard and the fence, and the other person's courtyard. And so his courtyard courtyard to the other courtyard. But nafla gader shalom machmas leika. But then afterwards, after he lit the fire, the fence between the courtyards fell, not as a result of the fire. The fence between the courtyards fell, irrespective of the fire. And then it goes and does the damage in the other courtyard. So therefore, the Hasam Kol Echitza, there he's not going to be responsible for his arrows. There he's only responsible for his money, because when at the time their courtyard. And so therefore we're going to exempt him if the utensil was hidden, because he's only responsible because it's his money, not because it's his arrow. Well, if that's the case, well, since Rabbi Yochanan says Isha Mishum Chitzav, well, his arrow didn't make it, so why is he liable? So the Gemara says, no, that's why we have to say, Laman de Islay Mishum Chitzav, Islay Nami Mishum Imona. Rabbi Yochanan says he's liable because of his arrows, but he's also liable because of his money. So Rabbi Yochanan has to say both. That's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, well, if that's the case, Ukagon, what we're talking about a case here is Shahayu Godra, that he had the ability to put up the fence, and he didn't put up the fence. The Hasam Shorohu will tafach ba'aped, because it's like he has an ox in his barn and he doesn't shut the door. And so therefore he's going to be responsible because of his money. So there it's not his arrows, there it's his money. So the Gemara says, well, if it's the case that since we're going to say that the one who says it's because it's his arrows also says it's because of his money. So Rabbi Yochanan also says it's also because of his money. Then what's the distinct Yochanan and the dog and the nation where the owner owns the owner of the fire owns the flame. So there we said earlier that there was a dispute. So the Gemara wants to know what's the dispute, what's the distinction between them in this specific case. And the Gemara says, Ika benayu l'chayvu ba'arbat dvarim. So the distinction that we come down to is, according to Reish Lakish, we're going to say, since he says it's mishum mamono, then you're not going to be liable since it's because of his money, you're not liable for the other activities of nezik, tsar, ripoy, and sheves. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, you were going to say that you're liable because it's your arrows for these other things that relate to damage, pain, and medical expenses, and lost wages. But humiliation is not going to be able to take effect under those circumstances, because this is not an area, and we'll get to this later on in our tractate, where we see when does humiliation expenses take effect. So that's a distinction. So the Gemara now says, we learned to the Mishnah that if the dog took the biscuit that has a coal attached to it and went to a stack and he ate the biscuit and burnt the stack, al harara, for the biscuit he pays full damages, and for the stack he pays half damages. So the Gemara asks the question, man chayev, who is the one who has to pay the half damages for the burning of the stack? So do we say it must be Baal Kelev? The owner of the dog is the one who's responsible. But why? We should say that the owner of the coal should also be liable, because he left his coal unwatched. The Gemara assumes, how else can the dog have gotten the coals if it hadn't been left unwashed? So the Gemara says no. The reason why the owner of the coal itself is not responsible is b'sheshimer gachalto. Our Mishnah is talking about a case where the owner of the coal watched it properly, and so therefore he left it in his house. The door was locked properly, and so therefore it's not his fault that the dog took the coal. The Gemara says, "Ikesheshimer gachalto." Well, if we're talking about a case where he actually watched the coals, my by kalifas, and then how'd the dog get it? If it was really watched properly, How'd the dog get it? So the Gemara says, Bishachasar. Now we're talking about a case where the dog somehow managed to dig underneath and get to it, even though it was guarded properly. So it says, when Mari Breder of Kahana, Zosamer, from here we're going to learn a different principle, that from the fact that the owner of the dog has to pay and not the owner of the coals in a situation where it's locked up in his house, we learn from here, Stam Delasos, that basic doors are, when they're closed, are considered Chasuros Hein Eitzel Kelev. We're going to say that basic doors are going to be considered closed vis-a-vis the door, and it's not going to be unusual. And so therefore, it's not an unusual action for a dog to bury underneath it. Even though the person who closes the door has provided sufficient protection, it's not an unusual activity for the dog to burrow under the door. And so therefore, while we're exempting the owner of the coal, we're going to hold the dog liable. So we're doing both things. On the one hand, we're saying that the dog didn't act unusually, and so therefore the owner of the dog is responsible for getting the coal. And secondly, we're saying that the owner of the coal itself did provide sufficient protection, and it's not his fault that the dog took it. So the Gemara wants to know, well, where did the dog eat it? Where did the dog itself eat this coal? Eat the biscuit. If you want to say that the owner of the biscuit ate it in just a regular amongst the stacks that were not owned by the owner. If you want to say that the owner of the dog ate it just in a field somewhere which was not owned by the owner of the biscuit, how can we hold the owner of the dog responsible for that? It has to be that he burnt it in another's field, and so he's only liable for eating if it was in the domain of the nizak and in the domain of the person who owned the food, and he's not Veleka. So therefore, why is he going to be responsible under these circumstances? So the Gemara says, no, we're talking about here is Lotricha the Acha Begadish the Baal Harar. Now we have to talk about a case here that he ate it in the field of the person who owned the biscuit. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, Tiff showed if that's the case that he owned in the field of the person who owned the biscuit, why don't we answer another case? Why don't we say that the law here is that if a dog eats the biscuit in the domain of the nizak, we're going to say that the owner is responsible for eating. We can prove from here about a different dispute. The pi para kechatzer hanizak tummy, that even though we're on top of 23b, even though the mouth of the cow is open and it's perhaps the owner of the cow's domain, we're going to say the mouth of the cow is considered like the domain of the damaged party. The ikechatzer amazik tummy, it seems so obvious, or else you can never be responsible for eating. But because otherwise, if it was the domain of the mazik, if it would be the domain of the owner of the cow, he could have said to him, well, your bread has no right to be in my cow's courtyard. And so since he's not saying that, we see from here that the domain of the cow, even the mouth of the cow, is still considered the domain of the nizak and not the domain of the mazik. The bailu, because the Gemara asked the question, pi para kechatzer nizak dami, or kechatzer mazik dami. The Gemara had a dispute about this. The mouth of the cow, is it considered like the courtyard of the nizak, or like the courtyard of the mazik? Is it like the courtyard of the damager or the damaged? The amr is kechatzer mazik dami. And if you want to say it's like the courtyard of the damaged party, Shein the Chiyav Rachmana Echem. How else would the Torah ever make you liable for eating if you're only liable in the domain of the nizak, and if your cow's mouth is like your domain, how would you ever be liable? So therefore, it must be the domain of your cow's mouth must be still the domain of the nizak and not your own domain. Amarav Mari Breder of Kahana. No, there is another possible way. How so? Remember, we have said already several times that shame does not just mean eating with your mouth. It means any benefit which you get, which the animal takes. And so there is this way. Let's say the animal rubbed against the wall for its own benefit. So that's in the domain of the nizak, and it's certainly not in the domain of the mazik. or if it soiled the fruit, or made its droppings on the food. And so therefore, because anything that's done for its own benefit is called shame. And so under these circumstances, it's certainly in the domain of the nizak, without any possibility that's in the domain of the mazik. So mazik for Marzutra challenges, he says, how can you say that's considered to be shame? We need to completely destroy the food, meaning to say that the animal needs to, in order for it to be shame, the animal needs to completely destroy the principle of Valeka. But under these circumstances, the animal is not completely destroying it. So why are we considering that a classic case of shame? So therefore, Ravina says that there is a circumstance where he destroys the principle. The Shaft Salme, basically that there were forms that were engraved on the wall. And so when the animal rolled against it, he destroyed those forms, those drawings on the wall. Rav Ashi says the pasi pesue, that when the animal made its droppings on the fruit, he buried them in mud, and when the mud dried, you couldn't get the food out of them, and so therefore, like plaster. So basically, he covered up the fruit as a result of his droppings, so they weren't visible, they weren't able to be gotten anymore. So the Gemara is trying to prove from our Mishnah that the mouth of the cow is considered like the courtyard of the nizak, of the damaged party. Tashma, we learn from the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, Shisa bo as a cow. Let's say a person is walking his dog and another person incites the dog to, or Shisa bo as a nachash, another person basically incites the dog or the snake to bite, and then the animal kills or jumps out and bites the one who caused it, who was enticing it. Potter, then, excuse me, I have this different case. I said the case wrong. A person basically tells his dog or tells a snake to bite somebody else, and then it bites him and kills him. Potter, he's going to be exempt since he didn't damage him specifically with his own hands. He just told the dog to attack. And so the Gemara says, Man Potter, who is the one who's exempt? Hameshasa Potter, v'chayev balakelev. The one the dog to attack is exempt, but the owner of the dog, which is the one that actually did the damage, he's going to be responsible for the damage. If you want to say it's like the domain of the courtyard, why are we going to say that the owner of the dog should be responsible? He could say, your hand has no business being in my dog's mouth. So the Gemara says, Ema patur af meshasa. So meaning to say that, maybe it means that not only is the owner of the dog, it's not a proof, because maybe you could say not only is the owner of the dog exempt, but also the inciter is exempt. Or alternatively, the afke nive visarte, that he took that the dog took its teeth out of its mouth. Basically, it really revealed its teeth, and he damaged him without bringing the hand into the domain of the dog. So therefore, it's not a proof yet. Mars is going to try again prove this question that the mouth of the animal is not going to be considered like your own domain, but still the domain wherever you are, the domain of the nizuk. Tashma, let's say we have the following case. Let's say a person grabbed a snake of another person in his hand, and he took the mouth of the snake and he put it in the hand of his friend until his friend's hand went into the mouth of the snake, and then the snake bit it. Under those circumstances, Rabbi Yehuda is going to say he's liable, and the Chachamim is going to say he's exempt. But Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, and Rav Acha bar Yaakov says in explaining their machlokas, when you look at their words closely, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Aros Nachash Bein Shinav made. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the reason why he's liable is because the snake's venom is going to be between his teeth, and so therefore it goes out without the intent of the snake. And so when the person brings the teeth of the snake to the hands of his friend, it's like he's killing him with a sword. And so therefore, Lefikach Makish B'Sayif, he's going to be responsible like a murderer. But V'Nachash Pater, whereas the snake itself is exempt. Meaning to say the snake itself didn't do anything. because the person is the one who killed him. But according to Chachamim, the snake is the one taking out its venom. And the person who brought the snake over to the man's hand, is going to be exempt. He's positive. I mean, if you want to say the mouth of the cow is like the courtyard of the one who's doing the damage, why doesn't he just say, my that you have no right to have your hand in my snake's mouth? So the Gemara says, this concept that maybe you have no right to put your hand in the mouth of my cow, we wouldn't say that with respect to the killing of a snake. Because even if the mouth of the snake is going to be considered like his own domain, nevertheless, the snake wouldn't be exempt from that. You're not allowed to kill somebody just because they're in your domain. With respect to damages, it takes effect, but not with respect to killing. Mar says, but why do we say there's a difference in Mana Tamra? Why should we say that there's a difference? Tanya, because we learned in the Brisa, let's say a person, and we're going to be approved for this. Tanya, this is binichusa, this is support for it. So where do we learn it? So if somebody enters into somebody else's courtyard without permission, and then as a result of this, his ox gores him and kills him. The ox is going to be stoned to death, and the owners are exempt from paying a ransom. So the Gemara explains, for my time. But why, if your ox kills somebody, why is your ox exempt from ransom under these circumstances? It says you have no permission to be in my courtyard. So if that's the case, well, if that's the case, why is the ox put to death? He should say, you have no permission to be in my courtyard. So it must be that this concept with respect to murder or with respect to killing, we don't say you have no right to be in my courtyard. And so therefore, even if he enters without permission, you still need to put the person to death. But with respect to the case of damages, then we could possibly apply that principle. So the Gemara says, Hanu easy debate Tarbu. So there was an incident with the goats that belonged to the Tarbu family, that they were destroying Rav Yosef's money because they were eating from his fields. So Amarei, Abaye. So Rav Yosef said to his student Abaye, Zil Emelahu Marayo, do its Nino. Go tell them that they should guard their goats so they don't eat from other people. So Abaye says to Rav Yosef, Amarei, Amai Ezel. Why do I have to go to them? The Zilna, if I go, Amarli, they're going to say to me, they're going to say to me, you should make a fence so that our goats don't go in there. So the Gemara says, Gadar, and if indeed we're going to say that the person has to make a fence, why can we ever have this case where you're liable for eating? Why don't we, for the animals eating, why don't we just say you should have made a fence? The Gemara says, no, where the animal dug in, where even though they had a fence to protect it, the animal still managed to get in. Or maybe the fence fell down at night before you could put it back up. So Machros Rav Yosef says, the Salkin Le'ela, that he said to those people who were going up from Babylon to the land of Israel, and those who are going from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Hani easy to shuka these goats from the butchers who are getting ready to be slaughtered, but we're waiting to them until market day. The mafsadi, who are destroying other people's money. Matrinan b'marayu treyu tlisa zamnim. We have to warn their owners 2 or 3 times to watch them properly. Itzayis, if they listen. Below, and if they don't listen, we should slaughter these goats. Amrinan lay, we should say to the butcher, Tiv amasachta v'kabel zuzech. Stay in your store and just receive the money for the sale of the meat. Meaning to say, since we could slaughter them even before the market day in order to prevent damage that's going on to other people. So this is today's daf. Obviously, there's a lot of very, very important concepts, and we're just touching on them. It's actually the daf only for Shabbos. Going to say Motzi Shabbos, I want to do another daf. I'll talk to you. I'll send out a message on Motzi Shabbos when exactly we'll do it. But if anybody has any questions, happy